My name is Nora Whitaker, and I was 27 the night my father tore my $96,000 nursing scholarship in half at table 7 of our family restaurant. He did it slowly. That was the part I remembered most. Not the sound, though I heard it. Not my mother's face, though I saw the way she lowered her eyes to her plate. Not even my brother Preston's little smirk from across the table, the kind he wore whenever he thought I had finally been put back in my place. It was how slowly my father tore the letter. He held it between both hands, right there between the iced tea pitcher and the basket of cornbread, and pulled until the paper split down the middle like it had offended him, like the mistake was not his anger, but my wanting. "You are not running off to Seattle," he said. "Not when this family needs you." The dining room was closed for the night, but the smell of hickory smoke still clung to everything. The curtains, the wood paneling, my scrub top, my hair. I had come straight from a 12-hour shift at the nursing home, still wearing shoes that hurt my feet, still carrying a folder I had protected all day, like it was something alive. My mother, Linda, touched her napkin but did not touch me. Preston leaned back and said, "You always make things bigger than they are." And at the far end of the table, beside the window that looked out over the dark parking lot, my grandmother Evelyn set her spoon down. Very quietly. No one noticed. I did. I picked up the two halves of my scholarship letter and lined the torn edges together beside my plate. Then, because I had been raised to smooth every silence in that family, I heard myself say, "I'm sorry." 2 weeks later, Grandma slid a gray folder across that same table and finally broke her silence. "Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 57% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right." All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. Whitaker's Smokehouse had been on East Sprague Avenue since 1987, though my father told the story like he had raised the building out of the dirt with his bare hands. The sign out front had once been bright red. By the time I was old enough to wipe fingerprints off the front door, the paint had faded into the color of dried brick, and the white letters had started peeling at the corners. Inside, everything smelled like smoke and sugar and old grease. Hickory in the curtains, vinegar in the mop water, brown sugar in the sauce warmers. The kind of smell that followed you home and settled into your clothes like a second skin. My father loved that smell. He said it meant work. He said it meant family. He said it meant Whitakers did not quit. What he never said was that some Whitakers were allowed to dream, and some of us were only allowed to be useful. After closing, table 7 belonged to him. It sat near the back wall, under the framed newspaper clipping from 1994, the one calling Whitaker's Smokehouse a Spokane staple. My father sat there every night with his ledger, his coffee, and his bad heart, speaking over the room like it was a kingdom, and the rest of us were lucky to have chairs. My mother sat to his right, always with a pen tucked behind her ear, even at dinner. She handled vendor calls, receipts, catering deposits, and the kind of apologies men like my father never made themselves. She could soften a complaint, calm an angry customer, and turn a burnt tray of ribs into a coupon for next Friday. People called her patient. I used to think that was a virtue. Preston sat wherever he wanted. That was the difference between us. My brother moved through that restaurant like someone who expected walls to shift for him. He was 24. Still, figuring things out, which meant he came in late, left early, and called every mistake a learning curve. He called the staff, the crew, though he could not remember half their names. My father called him the future of the business. I was the one who knew where the extra payroll checks were kept. I knew which cook needed Tuesdays off for dialysis. I knew the freezer door had to be kicked twice before it sealed. I knew my father took the white pill after breakfast and the blue one before bed, and that if my mother said she had eaten, she usually meant she had tasted sauce off a spoon at noon and forgotten the rest. Once, I changed out of blood-spotted scrubs in the employee bathroom after a double shift at the nursing home and went straight to fixing a payroll mistake Preston had made because my father said, "It'll only take you 5 minutes." It never took 5 minutes. Nothing they needed from me ever did. At the nursing home, I was Nurse Nora. At the restaurant, I was just Nora, which meant anyone could hand me anything heavy and assume I would carry it. And at the far end of table 7 sat Grandma Evelyn. She was 82, small enough that people mistook her quiet for frailty. She wore cardigans buttoned to the throat and counted tip money with fingers bent from arthritis, but still exact enough to catch a missing quarter. My father talked over her the way people talk over an old clock, aware of the sound but not the meaning. For years, I thought she sat there because there was nowhere else. I know better now. Grandma Evelyn sat at the end because she could see the whole room. The money, the signatures, the favors, the lies, and every time my father mistook volume for ownership. The Wednesday the fellowship email came. I was in the break room at Silver Pines Care Center with a paper cup of coffee I had reheated twice and still had not managed to drink. Room 214 had needed a dressing change. Mrs. Bell had refused her lunch unless I promised to sit with her for 3 minutes. Mr. Hanley had asked me to help him call his daughter in Arizona, because he said my fingers were better with phones than his were. By the time I finally sat down, there were 11 minutes left in my break and a smear of antiseptic on the back of my wrist. My phone buzzed beside the vending machine. The subject line said, "Congratulations, Cascadia Nursing Advancement Fellowship." For a second, I just stared at it. The word congratulations looked too large for that little screen, too bright for a room with flickering lights and a microwave that smelled like soup. I opened the email. Then I read it again. Then a third time. Slower. $96,000 over 3 years. Tuition assistance. Clinical placement support. First-year housing help near the University of Washington in Seattle. A pathway from LPN to RN, then forward if I could keep going. Near the bottom was a deadline I barely noticed then. August 30, 11:50, 9 p.m. I was too busy believing I had finally brought home something my father could not call foolish. I had filled out that application at the public library after late shifts. I had written my personal statement in the Notes app on my phone during quiet minutes between med passes. I had studied anatomy flashcards behind the restaurant office, while sauce invoices printed beside me. I had done all of it quietly, because in my family, a dream made less noise if you wanted it to survive. And still, the first thing I felt was not pride. It was hope. Small, embarrassing, dangerous. I pictured my father reading the letter. I pictured his face changing, even just a little. Not a hug. I knew better than to expect that. Not tears. Not some movie scene where he suddenly understood every year I had spent carrying what no one else wanted to carry. Just one nod. One sentence. "You did good, Nora." Not because those words would pay the deposit. Because I thought they might finally prove I was more than the hands everyone reached for when something needed carrying. I was 27 years old, wearing thrift store scrubs and shoes with the soles coming loose, and I still wanted those 4 words like a child reaching for a light switch she could never quite touch. Before my break ended, I drove to the library and printed the letter on clean white paper. I bought a blue folder for 99 cents and slid the pages inside, like they were something fragile enough to bruise. In the restroom mirror, I practiced smiling. "I got accepted," I whispered. "It's funded. I won't cost you anything." That last one I practiced the most. In my family, even joy had to prove it was not a burden. I carried the blue folder for 4 days before I showed it to them. That sounds cowardly now, but it did not feel like cowardice then. It felt like timing. It felt like waiting for the right temperature, in a room where one wrong word could turn the air sharp. I wanted my father in a good mood. I wanted my mother not to be tired. I wanted Preston not to be there, then decided it might be better if he was, because maybe my father would be kinder with an audience. That is how trained I was. By Sunday night, the restaurant had closed early after a long catering weekend, and everyone was too full of smoke and work to argue about anything small. My mother made cornbread in a cast-iron pan and put out leftover ribs, coleslaw, baked beans, and the sweet pickles my father liked. I told myself that was a good sign. People like me are always looking for good signs in rooms that have never been safe. Grandma Evelyn was already seated when I came in, her cardigan buttoned to the throat, her hands folded beside her water glass. She looked at the folder under my arm, then at my face. She did not smile. She did not warn me. She only gave the smallest nod, as if she had heard a bell the rest of us had missed. I waited until the plates were full. That was another habit. Bad news landed softer, I thought, if people had something warm in front of them. My father was talking about the Friday rush and how Preston needed to start thinking like an owner. Preston nodded like ownership was a shirt he already knew would fit. My mother was wiping a clean spot on the table with her thumb. I remember that thumb. Back and forth, over nothing. I set the blue folder beside my father's plate. I got some news, I said. My voice came out steady enough that, for one foolish second, I was proud of it. My father did not open the folder right away. He looked at it the way he looked at vendor invoices, already suspicious that something was asking too much of him. What is it? I got the fellowship, I said. The nursing one, in Seattle. Preston made a sound under his breath. Not a word. Just enough to let me know he had already decided this was ridiculous. I kept going. It covers tuition, clinical placement, some housing assistance the first year. I would need to leave in September, but I can help organize the books before I go. I can train someone on payroll. I can. Before you go? My father said. The room changed around those 4 words. He opened the folder then. Slowly. He read the first page, or at least he moved his eyes over it. I watched his face for the thing I had rehearsed in my head. Surprise softening into pride, confusion giving way to respect, even irritation losing the fight against the facts printed in black ink. Instead, his jaw tightened. Seattle, he said. It's the University of Washington program, I said. It's a real pathway, Dad. LPN to RN, then. A real pathway away from here. No, I said too quickly. Not away. Forward. My mother's fork stopped moving. Grandma Evelyn's eyes were on my father now. He turned the page, saw the deadline, saw the relocation line, and let out a small laugh that had no humor in it. So while your mother is handling inventory, while my doctor is telling me to keep stress down, while your brother is trying to learn the business, you thought this was the time to run off? I'm not running off, I said. I earned this. That was my mistake. Not because it was wrong. Because it was the one sentence in that house my father could never allow from me. He held the letter up between both hands. No daughter of mine abandons her family for a certificate. It isn't a certificate. The first rip cut through the university seal. The second took my name with it. He placed the pieces beside the cornbread like scraps from a coupon sheet and picked up his glass of iced tea. You'll stay here, he said. You'll help your mother. You'll help me. You can do nursing in Spokane if you need a hobby. Nobody moved. My mother whispered his name, but softly, like she was afraid of being heard taking my side. She looked at the torn paper, then at my father, and chose the safer grief. Her hand moved toward me for half a second, then folded back into her lap. Preston leaned back and said, Dad's right. We all have to sacrifice. At the far end of the table, Grandma Evelyn set her spoon down. The sound was small, silver on stoneware, almost nothing, but my body heard it. My father did not. He was already buttering cornbread, satisfied with the order he had restored. I looked at the torn pages. My name was split across 2 pieces, Nora on one side, Whitaker on the other. And because some habits are older than pain, I reached for them. I'm sorry, I said. My mother's shoulders lowered, relieved that I had made the room comfortable again. I gathered the pieces carefully, as if neatness could undo violence, and carried my plate to the dish station. The water was already hot. Steam rose against my face. I stood there, with my hands under the faucet, and listened to them start talking again behind me. About the remodel. About the weekend numbers. About Preston's ideas. As if my future had not just been torn in half between dinner and dessert. I did not know yet that the torn letter was not the worst thing my father would do to that scholarship. It was only the first thing I saw. That night, I taped the scholarship letter back together at the little desk in my room above the garage. The tape caught the light in crooked strips. No matter how carefully I pressed the torn fibers flat, the university seal still looked broken. My name still had a scar through it. I kept smoothing the page with the side of my thumb, like paper could heal if someone touched it gently enough. Near the bottom, under the fellowship details I had been too happy to study closely before, was the line that suddenly mattered more than the $96,000. Confirmation deposit due August 30, 11:59 p.m. I stared at that date until it stopped looking like words. 12 days. The deposit was $750. The background check, uniforms, licensing transfer, travel to Seattle, and even a room deposit all cost money. The fellowship did not hand me up front. I opened my banking app. 418美元, 62美分. That number sat on the screen like an answer from a world that did not care how badly I wanted to be brave. For a while, I just sat there with the taped letter in front of me and the smell of smoke still in my hair. Downstairs, I could hear the back door of the restaurant open and close. My father's voice carried through the floorboards, easy again, restored to himself. Something had changed. I was not sure yet if it was the room or me. The next morning, I tried the direct way, because there was still a part of me that believed reasonable words could matter if I arranged them carefully enough. My father was at table 7 with coffee and the previous week's invoices. I stood across from him with my hands folded so he would not see them shake. "I'm not asking you to pay," I said. "I'm asking you not to stop me." He did not look up from the paper. "You don't know what you're asking." "I do." "No, Nora. You know classes and books. You don't know life." I almost laughed at that. I had changed dressings on infected wounds. I had held old women's hands while they forgot their children's names. I had worked 12-hour shifts, and then come home to fix payroll mistakes made by a brother who still called responsibility stress. But in my father's mouth, life was always whatever proved him right. "I can get extra shifts," I said. "Marisol said I can stay with her at first. The fellowship covers most of it. I just need." "You need to stop embarrassing yourself." The words were quiet. That made them worse. My mother was by the coffee station, refilling sugar packets no customer would touch until lunch. I turned to her because some childish part of me still looked for the softer door. "Mom." Just that. A whole prayer in one word. She did not turn around right away. She finished lining the pink packets with the pink packets and the yellow ones with the yellow ones. Then she said, "Your father's heart can't take this kind of stress right now." I felt the sentence land before I understood it. Not my heart. His. Not the future he had torn. The stress I had caused by wanting one. "He tore up my letter," I said. My mother closed the sugar caddy. "He's scared," she said. "You know how men get when they're scared." I looked at her back. The same back I had watched bend over receipts, over sinks, over apology after apology she never owed anyone. "Can't you wait one more year?" she asked. One more year. In my family, those words did not mean time. They meant a hole with nice curtains. I nodded, because nodding had kept me safe for so long that my body reached for it before my pride could stop it. Then I walked out through the side door into the alley behind the restaurant, where the dumpsters smelled sour in the August heat, and the morning sun hit the brick wall hard enough to make me squint. I did not cry there. I made calls. I called the fellowship office and asked if deposits could be delayed. The woman on the phone was kind, in the way people are kind when the answer is still no. I called Silver Pines and asked for extra shifts. They could give me 2, maybe 3, but payroll would not process until after the deadline. I texted Marisol, and she answered within a minute. "You can have my couch. Don't you dare give up." I sold my sewing machine online for $60 to a woman who said she needed it for church costumes. I picked up an evening shift and ate peanut butter crackers in my car. I wrote every number on the back of an old catering receipt. The math did not care that I had earned the door. It only cared that I could not yet reach the handle. That night, my mother left a plate covered in foil outside my room. Meatloaf, green beans, a folded napkin. No note. That was her apology style. Food instead of courage. I sat on the floor beside it and understood something I had been avoiding for years. My mother was not going to save me. Not because she did not love me. That would have been simpler. She loved me, in the only way she had been allowed to practice. Quietly, carefully, without ever disturbing the man who had built his comfort out of everyone else's silence. And if I stayed, she would call that love. I did not know Grandma Evelyn had already written the same deadline down in a notebook she kept locked behind the restaurant office. I only looked at the taped letter on my desk, the deadline circled in blue ink, and for the first time the fear inside me stopped begging. It began counting. By the next morning, my father had changed the story. Not the facts. Men like my father rarely bothered with facts, once they had found a version that made them look noble. He had not torn my scholarship because he was angry. He had done it because he was worried. He had not humiliated me at dinner. He had protected me from making a mistake. He had not trapped me. He had reminded me where I belonged. By lunch, Aunt Dina had called my mother to say she was praying I would come back to my senses. By 3, one of my father's friends from the Rotary Club stopped by the restaurant and clapped him on the shoulder like he had survived something. "Kids don't understand duty anymore," the man said, loud enough for me to hear from the office. My father sighed in that tired, righteous way people use when they want sympathy for the damage they caused. "She's a good girl," he said. "Just confused." Confused. That word followed me for the next week. When I picked up my father's prescription from the pharmacy, the woman behind the counter said, "Your dad tells me you might be leaving town. Big change with his condition." When I came in from a double shift, my mother handed me the pill organizer and said, "Just make sure he takes the blue one before bed. I know you're upset, but he still needs you." When Preston misplaced the staff schedule, he dropped the clipboard beside my purse and said, "Can you fix this before you do whatever scholarship research thing you're doing?" Before. That was how they made my life disappear. They did not forbid it every second. They simply placed theirs in front of it until mine had no room left to stand. I started sleeping badly. Not much. 3 hours. 4 if I was lucky. I would wake up before dawn thinking of numbers. $750. August 30. 11:59. Seattle, September. $418.62. Then I would go downstairs and find a note from my mother taped to the coffee maker. Cardiology follow-up Thursday. Inventory count before dinner. Call insurance about Dad's refill. No one ever wrote, "Confirm your future before it expires." On Thursday, I called Dr. Hannah Mercer's office from the alley behind the restaurant, holding the phone close so the delivery truck would not drown me out. Dr. Mercer was my father's cardiologist, 61, silver-haired, direct in a way I liked, because she did not decorate the truth before handing it to you. When she called back, I asked the question as carefully as I could. If I leave for school in Seattle, would that put my father at medical risk? There was a pause. Is that what he told you? More or less. Another pause. Softer this time. Your father needs medication compliance, follow-up appointments, diet changes, and less sodium than I suspect he is eating at that restaurant. He does not medically require his daughter to give up her education. I closed my eyes. The alley smelled like hot garbage and fryer oil, but for 1 second, I could breathe. That sentence did not solve anything. It did not pay the deposit. It did not make my mother brave or my father kind. But it took one lie off my shoulders, and I had been carrying so many I felt lighter just losing one. That night, Preston spread remodeling sketches across table 7, flat screens along the west wall, a new bar, trivia nights, local beer taps. He called it modernizing the brand, though he still could not tell brisket from chuck roast unless Bernie labeled the cooler. My father glowed. "This is what commitment looks like," he said. Bernie Shaw stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. He had been our pitmaster for 22 years and had the expression of a man watching a child draw windows on a boat. Later, when I passed him by the smoker, he said quietly, "Your brother doesn't know the difference between margin and markup." I almost smiled. Then I looked through the doorway at Preston laughing, at my father nodding, at my mother pretending not to see the numbers no one wanted to add. And I understood the shape of it. They were not keeping me because I was weak. They were keeping me because I was useful. 3 days before the deadline, my father stopped being loud about the scholarship. That should have warned me. For a week, he had made a performance out of disappointment. He sighed when I walked through the dining room. He lowered his voice when customers passed, as if my ambition was a private illness. He told anyone close enough to listen that young people had forgotten what family meant. But on Tuesday morning, he was calm. Too calm. He asked me if I had picked up his refill. He asked whether the Thursday catering deposit had cleared. He asked if I could cover the dinner shift, because Preston had meetings about the remodel. He did not mention Seattle once. I thought maybe he had run out of ways to punish me. That afternoon at Silver Pines, I was changing the sheets in room 118 when my phone buzzed in my scrub pocket. I waited until Mrs. Kepler was settled, her blanket tucked the way she liked it, corners tight because she said loose sheets made her feel forgotten. Then I stepped into the supply room and checked the screen. The email was from the fellowship office. "Dear Miss Whitaker, we received a call regarding your family emergency and your intent to defer your place in the Cascadia Nursing Advancement Fellowship. Please confirm your deferral in writing by 5 p.m. For a moment, the shelves went blurry. Gauze, gloves, alcohol wipes, blue bed pads stacked in plastic. Ordinary things, sitting perfectly still while my future tilted under my feet. I read the email again, then again. There are sentences that do not look violent until you understand who put them there. I had not called anyone. I had not deferred. I had not given up. I sat down on a cardboard box of medium gloves because my knees had stopped being reliable. The supply room smelled like disinfectant and paper, and somewhere down the hall someone was laughing at a daytime game show. Life kept making its small noises, even when mine had gone quiet. When I called the fellowship office, my voice sounded so steady I almost did not recognize it. The woman on the phone was careful, professional, kind enough to make it worse. She said a man identifying himself as my father had called that morning. He said there had been a medical crisis at home. He said I was under significant emotional strain. He said the family believed I was not in a position to make a responsible decision right now. Responsible. That word again. The one they put on me when they needed help, and took away when I needed freedom. I thanked her. I actually thanked her. Then I asked what I needed to send to correct the record. She told me to reply in writing. Confirm I had not authorized the deferral. Attach identification. Reaffirm my intent to accept. She said they could note the account, but the deposit still had to be paid by August 30. I hung up and stared at the phone in my hand. My father had not only tried to close the door, he had tried to make it look like I had closed it myself. That was the part that changed me. Not the torn paper, not the jokes, not even my mother's silence. This was different. This was him reaching outside the family, into the first place that had ever said yes to me, and telling them I could not be trusted with my own life. I sent Marisol a screenshot. She called within 30 seconds. Tell them in writing you didn't authorize it, she said. No hello, no gasp, just action. Attach your license, attach the original award email. And Nora? Yeah? Stop giving your family paper copies of doors they can close. I stood in that supply room with my back against the metal shelf, and something cold and clean moved through me. I forwarded the email to myself. I saved the original award letter. I took screenshots of every message from my mother about Dad's appointments, every shift I had covered, every payroll file I had fixed. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was beginning to understand that, in my family, whoever held the paperwork got to tell the story. That night, Grandma Evelyn knocked on my door with 2 cups of tea. She looked at my face once. He called them, didn't he? She asked. I did not ask how she knew. I just nodded. Grandma set the tea on my desk beside the taped scholarship letter and looked at the circled deadline. "What time?" she asked. "Friday," I said. 11:59. She folded her hands over the head of her cane. "Then Thursday dinner," she said. Her voice was quiet. "You keep your seat at that table one more night." I did not sleep after Grandma left. I sat at my desk, with both cups of tea going cold, the taped scholarship letter between them, and tried to understand the look on her face when she said Thursday dinner. It had not been anger. Anger moves fast. It throws things, slams doors, burns hot enough to make mistakes. Grandma Evelyn's face held something slower, something stored. The next morning, I started seeing her differently. The way you notice a painting has been crooked for years only after someone points to the nail. She had always handled the property tax envelopes. My father called them the county's yearly robbery, but Grandma was the one who opened them, wrote the checks, and filed the receipts in the locked drawer behind the restaurant office. She was the one the bank manager greeted by name when we ran catering deposits after holiday weekends. She was the one who knew which freezer repair had been paid from operating cash and which one had gone on the line of credit. My father talked about ownership. Grandma kept records. Those are not the same thing. For years, I had mistaken her quiet for distance. At family dinners, while my father explained the business to people who already knew less than he thought, Grandma cut her food into small, careful pieces and listened. When Preston announced plans for the remodel, she asked one question about projected debt and then went silent after he answered with the phrase, "brand energy." When my mother said nothing, Grandma saw that too. She had been seeing everything. On Wednesday afternoon, I left Silver Pines early after swapping shifts with Marisol's cousin, then walked the 6 blocks from the bus stop toward the restaurant. I was cutting through 2nd Avenue because it was quieter when I saw Grandma come out of a low brick building beside the pharmacy. She was wearing her dark green cardigan, even though the day was warm. In her left hand was a gray folder. The sign on the glass door read, "Ruth Ann Pike, Estate Planning and Trust Law." Grandma paused on the sidewalk and adjusted the folder against her chest, not like paper, like weight. I stepped behind a parked delivery van before I could think better of it, not because I wanted to spy on her, because something in me was afraid if she saw me, the moment would vanish and become ordinary. She did not look fragile then. She looked old, yes, tired, maybe, but there was a straightness in her back. I had missed my whole life because I had been looking for strength in the wrong places. I had thought strength sounded like my father's voice carrying across a dining room. I was beginning to understand strength could also be an 82-year-old woman standing alone on a sidewalk with a folder full of things no one loud had bothered to read. That night, she found me behind the restaurant, sitting on an overturned milk crate near the smoker while Bernie cleaned the ash pan inside. "You saw me," she said. It was not a question. I looked down at my hands. "I didn't mean to. I know." She sat on the crate beside me with a careful little breath, the kind people her age make when lowering themselves onto something not built for comfort. For a while, neither of us spoke. The smoker ticked as it cooled. A train horn sounded somewhere far off. The alley smelled like wet brick and old hickory. "Finally," she said. "Your Aunt Celia wanted to leave once." I turned toward her. "Dad's sister?" Grandma nodded. "She was 19, wanted to go to Boise and learn floral design." Your grandfather laughed. Calvin laughed with him, because boys learn early which side of the table rewards them. She rubbed one bent thumb over the other. Celia left with $62 and a paper grocery bag. Didn't speak to us for 7 years. I had met Aunt Celia only twice, both times at funerals. She owned a flower shop now. She wore turquoise rings and smiled like someone who had paid dearly for the right to breathe. "I should have helped her," Grandma said. There was no drama in her voice. That made it hurt more. I was too quiet then. The alley seemed to hold still around us. "And now?" I asked. Grandma looked at the back door of the restaurant, at the place where my father's voice could rise through brick and glass and make everyone inside rearrange themselves around it. "Now," she said, "I am done letting men call a locked door tradition. She reached into the tote bag beside her feet and touched the edge of the gray folder, but she did not open it. Not yet. Some doors are not locked to keep women in, Nora, she said. Some are locked to keep foolish men out. Then she stood, slow but steady, and went back inside before I could ask her what was in the folder. Which meant, of course, that I had to wait one more dinner to find out. That night, after Grandma went back inside, I packed a black duffel bag. I did it quietly, not because I was sneaking, but because noise felt like asking permission. 2 sets of scrubs, 1 sweater, jeans, socks, my nursing license, my birth certificate, the repaired scholarship letter folded into the inside pocket where it would not bend again. I counted the cash from my nightstand and tucked it into an envelope. $612, most of it in 20s, some of it still smelling faintly like the register drawer. It was not enough. I packed it anyway. There is a kind of readiness that does not wait for certainty. I did not know where I would sleep after Marisol's couch. I did not know whether the fellowship office would believe me over my father. I did not know if I could pay the deposit before Friday night. But I knew I was done standing still, just because the people around me preferred me trapped. My mother came upstairs while I was folding my second scrub top. I had not heard her on the steps. She stood in the doorway and looked at the duffel bag on my bed, as if it were a body. "You're really going to do this to us?" she asked. "Not. Are you scared?" "Not. Do you have enough money?" "Not. What did your father do that made you pack a bag?" "This to us." I kept folding. "Do what, Mom?" "Leave." The word sounded criminal in her mouth. I put the scrub top into the bag and smoothed it once with my palm. "I'm going to school." She crossed her arms, but it did not make her look strong. It made her look cold. "Your father will never forgive you." There it was, the last chain polished up to look like concern. For 27 years, forgiveness in our family had meant the same thing as obedience. If you did what Calvin wanted, peace returned. If you refused, everyone called the damage yours. I looked at my mother and felt the old pull to comfort her. To say I was sorry, to tell her I would think about it, to make my leaving small enough for her to survive. Instead, I zipped the duffel halfway. "Then he can keep that," I said. "I don't need to carry it for him." Her face changed, just for a second. Not anger, not exactly. More like recognition, painful and unwanted. I wondered if she had once packed a bag too. Maybe not with clothes. Maybe only in her head. Maybe she had unpacked it so many times she forgot there had ever been a door. She looked past me at the taped scholarship letter on my desk. "You don't know what it's like out there," she said. "No," I said, "but I know what it's like in here." She had no answer for that. After she left, I finished packing. I placed my work shoes by the door, set my phone charger on top of the bag, and checked the fellowship email one more time. The deadline had not moved. The money had not appeared. Nothing was solved. But something was decided. I lay down on top of the blanket without changing clothes. Downstairs, the restaurant settled into its usual night sounds. Pipes ticking, ice machine humming, someone moving chairs across the floor. For the first time, those sounds did not feel like home. They felt like a room I was finally ready to leave. Thursday came in gray and heavy. The kind of August day that forgets it is supposed to be summer. I worked the morning shift at Silver Pines with my duffel bag locked in the trunk of my car and my phone in my scrub pocket, checking it every chance I got. No new email from the fellowship office, no miracle deposit. No sudden message saying a mistake had been made, and the door would stay open whether I had the money or not. The world does not usually announce mercy ahead of time. By 4, I was back at the restaurant. My mother had closed the front dining room early and turned the sign to Privet Event, though there was no event except whatever Grandma Evelyn had decided was finally due. The tables were wiped clean. The chairs were stacked near the front window. The smell of smoke still hung low in the room, but underneath it was lemon cleaner and something nervous. My father was already at table 7. Of course he was. He had changed into his good button-down, the blue one he wore for bank meetings and Rotary lunches, as if clothing could make a man more correct. Preston sat beside him with a rolled-up set of remodeling sketches and the bright, restless confidence of someone who had never had a door shut in his face. My mother moved between the kitchen and the table, setting down meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, iced tea. Food for peace, food for silence, food for pretending we were not all sitting around a fuse. Grandma Evelyn came in last. She wore the dark green cardigan, buttoned all the way to the throat. In one hand, she carried her black tote bag. In the other, her cane, though I noticed she barely leaned on it. She looked at me once, not warmly, not dramatically, just once, long enough to remind me of what she had said. Keep your seat at that table one more night. So I sat. My bag was not inside the restaurant. It was in my car, parked 2 blocks away, because I did not trust myself to leave it where my mother could find it and call it a wound. Dinner began the way family disasters often do, with normal things pretending to matter. Preston talked first. He spread his sketches across the corner of the table, nearly touching the gravy boat, and explained the sports bar idea again. Flat screens on the west wall, trivia nights, local beer, a new sign. He used the word future 3 times, and did not once mention the cooks, the debt, or the customers who came because the place still felt like 1987. My father nodded like a king hearing from his prince. This, he said, tapping the paper, is commitment. Then his eyes moved to me. Nora here has been sulking about Seattle long enough. My mother's hand tightened around the iced tea pitcher. I did not speak. My father leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow, we'll call that program together and decline properly. After that, we'll talk about giving you a real role here. Office manager, maybe. Something stable, something useful. Useful. The word landed exactly where he meant it to. Preston smiled and added, once construction starts, you can handle staff schedules. You're good at that stuff. I looked down at my hands in my lap. They were still. That surprised me. For once, I did not feel like explaining myself. I did not feel like proving I was not selfish, not unstable, not confused. I had spent so many years laying evidence at that table, and they had always found a way to use it as a placemat. Across from me, Grandma Evelyn folded her napkin. Slowly, precisely. Then she set it beside her plate and stood. The room stopped before anyone spoke. Even my father looked up. Grandma reached for the tote bag at her feet. Her fingers closed around the gray folder. And for the first time in my life, Table 7 did not feel like my father's table. It felt like a witness stand. Grandma Evelyn did not clear her throat. She did not ask for attention. She simply stood with the gray folder in both hands, and the room gave itself to her because something in her stillness made noise unnecessary. My father blinked first. Mother, sit down. She looked at him down the length of Table 7. Calvin, she said, call Seattle tonight. Tell them you lied. The silence after that was not empty. It was full of every year he had mistaken her quiet for permission. My father laughed once. A hard, surprised sound. This again, he said. You and Nora have worked yourselves into a state. I didn't lie. I handled a family matter. Grandma slid the folder across the table. It moved slowly over the polished wood, past the mashed potatoes, past Preston's remodeling sketches, past the ring of water from my father's iced tea glass, and stopped against his plate. Open it, she said. He did not want to. I saw that before his hand moved. I saw it in the way his shoulders tightened, in the way his mouth held its shape too long. Men like my father can feel the ground shift before they admit their feet are moving. Finally, he opened the folder. The first page was not long. That was what made it worse. There was nowhere for him to hide inside complicated language. His eyes went to the heading, then to the signature, then back to the heading, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he stared hard enough. Grandma said, "Read the owner's name." My father's face changed. Preston leaned over. "What is it?" My mother did not move. She had one hand pressed against the edge of the table, knuckles pale. My father whispered, "This is old." "No," Grandma said. "It is recorded." He turned another page. Then another. The restaurant. The brick house behind it. The west parking lot. The operating account authorization. The trust amendment signed 3 months earlier, with Ruthann Pike's seal on every copy. None of it had my father's name where he expected it to be. Grandma's voice stayed level. "Your father's life insurance bought this building in 1987. My bookkeeping kept it open when you were too proud to admit you were losing money. My name has been on the papers from the beginning. Later, those assets moved into the Whitaker family trust. Last month, I made that trust irrevocable." My father looked up then. "You can't do that." "I already did." Preston grabbed one of the papers, scanning like a man looking for a door in a wall. "What about the remodel?" Grandma turned to him. "There will be no remodel." His mouth opened, then closed. My father stood so fast his chair scraped backward. "I ran this place for 30 years. "Yes," Grandma said. "You ran it." She let the difference sit there. "You served food here. You signed schedules here. You shouted orders here. You sat at this table and called it yours. But you have never owned the restaurant, the house, the parking lot, or the right to use any of it to bury your daughter's future." The words landed one by one. Not loud. Final. Then Bernie stepped in from the kitchen doorway and set a thin stack of papers beside the folder. Expense reports, credit card records, Preston's bar deposits, numbers no one had wanted to read out loud. Grandma did not look away from my father. "For 90 days, you are removed from financial authority. Bernie will manage operations with oversight from Ruthann Pike's office. Preston will not access company accounts. And tonight, before this family leaves this table, you will call the fellowship office and correct what you did." My father's mouth moved, but nothing came out. For the first time in my life, the loudest man in the room had no story ready. Then Grandma turned to me. Her face softened, but only a little. "There is an education fund in your name," she said. "Enough for the deposit, the move, and what the fellowship does not cover at the beginning." I could not speak. She pushed one final paper toward me. "I am not giving you a future, Nora. You earned that. I am only unlocking the door." For one long second, I wanted to take everything. I wanted to watch my father sit under rules he had not written. I wanted Preston to ask me before spending $1. I wanted my mother to look at me across table 7 and finally understand what it felt like to be afraid of someone else's silence. That wanting was real. It was hot and sweet and human. Then I looked at the table, at the water rings, at the torn edge of Preston's sketches, at the place where my scholarship letter had been ripped apart, at the chair where my father had spent years mistaking height for authority. I understood then that if I stayed to win in that room, the room would still have me. So I stood. "I don't want the restaurant," I said. My father looked at me as if I had spoken in another language. "I don't want table 7. I don't want your chair. I don't want an apology that only comes because Grandma proved you were never in charge." My voice did not shake. That surprised me. "I want the life I earned before you tried to tear it in half." No one answered. Out of habit, my hand moved toward my plate. I almost picked it up, almost carried it to the sink, almost became useful one more time. Then I stopped. I left it there. My mother made a small sound. Nora. Just my name. The way I had once said hers, asking for help she did not give. I looked at her, and I felt the old pull to soften the room for her. But love, I had learned, was not the same as making yourself easier to use. "I love you," I said, "but I'm not staying so you don't have to be honest about your own life." I walked out through the side door. Grandma followed me into the alley, where the evening air smelled like rain on hot brick. She reached up and buttoned the top button of my jacket with hands that did not tremble. "There," she said. "Now you're ready to leave the room." I cried then, but not the old way. Not begging tears. "Come with me," I whispered. She smiled. "This is still my house, child. I intend to enjoy that." The next morning, I paid the deposit before sunrise. At 6:40, I boarded a bus to Seattle with a black duffel, a foil-wrapped sandwich from Grandma, and the taped scholarship letter in my pocket. I became a nurse anesthetist years later. I still call Grandma every Sunday. My father kept sitting at table 7 for a while, I'm told. But after that night, everyone knew exactly what the chair was worth. He tore a letter. He did not tear my future. It had never been in his hands. Some families teach you love by holding you close. Others teach you survival by making you understand exactly when to leave. Nora's story is not only about a scholarship, it is about all the quiet ways a person can be trained to believe their dreams are an inconvenience. It is about being called responsible so many times that you forget responsibility was never supposed to mean surrender. It is about the kind of family that praises you for carrying everything, then calls you selfish the moment you ask to put something down. And maybe that is the lesson worth keeping. Love should not require you to disappear. A family can need you. A parent can be afraid. A house can be full of history, duty, sickness, bills, memories, and unfinished apologies. But none of those things give anyone the right to tear up your future and call it protection. Real love may ask for patience. It may ask for sacrifice. But it does not ask you to become smaller so someone else can feel powerful. Nora spent years thinking freedom would come when her father finally saw her worth. But the truth was harder and cleaner than that. Her worth was never waiting for his approval. It was already there. In every shift she worked, every form she filled out, every tired morning she got up and kept going. Her grandmother did not give her a future. She reminded her that the future had always belonged to her. Sometimes healing begins with a dramatic moment. A folder sliding across a table. A truth finally spoken. A door finally opened. But sometimes, it begins even smaller. A plate left on the table. A bag packed under the bed. A sentence you do not apologize for. A decision to stop begging people to value what they have already chosen not to see. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. What was the table you had to walk away from? Was it a family expectation, a relationship, a job, or a version of yourself you outgrew? And if you believe quiet people can still win loud battles, please like this video, subscribe, and stay with us for the next story.